This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Hello again, everybody. I'm Ron Brownstein, Editorial Director of Atlantic Media, and we are here to talk about technology for social change. And to do that, we have a very interesting panel who comes at this from very different angles. To my immediate left, Jamie Alexander is the co-founder and software architecture lead for the Foundation for Learning Equality. He is also a PhD candidate in cognitive science here at UC San Diego. To his left, Peggy Johnson, Executive Vice President and President of Global Market Development for Qualcomm Technologies, where she is responsible for commercializing new business opportunities and developing strategic relationships for the company. And to her left, Clark Gibson is a professor of political science and director of the International Studies Program at the University of California, San Diego, right here. So thank you all for joining me. We're going to talk about some broad issues and questions about the role of technology in either expanding or constricting opportunity. I think in popular culture, I kind of think of the two poles of this vision as being 1984 on the one hand, and maybe the Apple 1984 ad on the other, about whether technology ultimately really does produce more opportunity and autonomy for the individual or less. But you all are working on projects that in different ways try to push the positive side of that needle. And maybe we could start by having each of you talk a little bit about what you're doing. Jamie, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I'm working with an awesome group of people with the Foundation for Learning Equality to bring this vision of expanding access to educational materials around the world. So there's been this explosion in the last few years, especially, of online learning resources, ways to go online and learn for free. And for people who have internet access, that's been a huge revolution. People who never had access to higher education or to building up, changing careers, learning new skills, now have a way to tap in and learn those skills and take a new direction with their lives and empower themselves. And it's changing classrooms. It's allowing teachers to flip their classrooms, to have materials that students can learn from at home, and then the classroom time can be spent, rather than lecturing, engaging with students, doing group-based project activities, and having the teacher mentor and work more directly with students. So what we've seen, though, is that while this is being made available to more people than ever before, it's limited to the people who have internet, and that's only 1/3 of the world. So with 2/3 of the world still without access to internet, there's a huge swath of humanity that's not able to take advantage of this. So we're trying to find ways to bridge those gaps and to knock down the barriers to access by building software that can be distributed offline to offline communities, to be run directly in the classroom or in an orphanage or in a home, and to allow students learners to engage with that content, and teachers to work directly with them and help students that are struggling and learn at their own pace, and really make a difference in their lives by sharing learning materials more broadly.
We'll come back and talk about some of the details in a minute. But Peggy, I guess you come in at the point about the 2/3
Right.
that lacks access.
Right. So I'm from Qualcomm, and we develop a lot of the technology and the chips that go into a lot of the mobile devices. And right now, about 2.2 billion smartphones in the world today. But the gap is closing very fast. In the next 4 or 5 years, that's going to double. In a world of about 7 billion people, we'll have about 4.5 billion smartphones. And I think, when we stepped back at one point and said, what is the real meaning of that? What's going to happen when everybody, literally, in a few more years after that, virtually the entire world is going to have access to low-cost smartphones, and what does that mean? And we started a corporate initiative called Wireless Reach. It's a strategic program. We started several years ago, and we now have about 80 different projects in 30 countries. And we're studying the effects of mobile and access to content on different traditional industries like health, education, entrepreneurship. And we've had some fascinating results, very positive. We know, it's a little cliche, but knowledge is power. And we know when we reach out into a village in Indonesia or a farm in rural Brazil and bring a little bit of power, great things happen. And so it's been a fascinating several years. And that's a lot of what I work on.
We'll come back and talk a little bit more of that in a minute. Clark, tell us
That's
about
a perfect segue from Peggy, because we use the smartphones where they're not used as much. So my team and we work on elections in fragile democracies, and we bring ICT, information and communications technology, equipment, software to make the process better. So we both do research, but we have domestic partners. And I gave a talk later today at the lab session, if you want to come. What we do is we do techniques that can detect electoral fraud, reduce electoral fraud. We get participation from the citizens themselves. It's a new model of election monitoring rather than sending international monitors in, which is actually not proven to do anything. So this is a new way to empower citizens in their own democratic process.
So let me ask you, I'll talk a little bit more about each of these and then kind of bring you all in for a broader discussion. But Clark, let me stick with you for a minute, because you alluded to this, and there's one sentence in your CV that describes what you do this way. Using domestic researchers, cell phones, custom applications, and random samples of polling stations, Professor Gibson and his team have detected and reduced electoral misconduct in Afghanistan, Uganda, and Kenya. Now, with all due respect, that sounds like a great way to get hurt. Talk about, in practice, what does this mean? Is someone who is standing where with what, trying to discourage who from doing what?
So that's a great question. And yes, fragile democracies are fragile democracies. So in most of these places, we are partnered with a local polling firm. And so the polling firm has educated staff who know the country, and their management knows when and where to send them or not. So we sample with the staff in mind. So we've had no problems there. And the polling firm and our team, and just lately in Kenya this last spring, we also did a project where we also partnered with an NGO doing also domestic monitoring. We're all accredited as election observers by the central government. So we are there to prevent fraud by the virtue of the central government. So we have some safety there.
Aren't there occasions where the central government is the one perpetrating the fraud?
In every case, the central government is perpetrating the fraud. But opposition also cheats too.
Yeah.
Opposition cheats. But the central government, they have the power, they have the resources. So it's usually, if not the central government per se, it's entrenched incumbents.
Yeah. So who are you recruiting? How do you find your networks, and what are they looking for? What are they watching?
So this goes into technology again, and I'll give the talk. You have to come to the talk. Yeah. So we don't do traditional monitoring as in going into the polling station and trying to see fraud. What we do is actually quite simple, and it's designed that way to be to measure its effectiveness better. We don't know. No one knows for sure if monitoring works. It lends support to a process. Jimmy Carter, I've been on some of his teams. It encourages something, but we don't have any measures if it does anything at all. And in fact, the latest research has election monitors from the outside associated with worse electoral outcomes and more fraud. Yeah. There's an endogeneity problem there. But anyway, the issue there is, so we wanted to create something that could be measured. And what we do is we have a polling firm and or NGOs, staff. We train them on smartphones, which many of them have never seen, a special application developed here at Klight 2 at UC San Diego to go into the polling station and hand the polling manager a letter. And the letter just says, we're going to take a picture of the tally that you must post publicly at the end of elections. Our people do not stay there all day. They merely deliver the letter, It's a slight nudge, and that letter does its job.
Yeah. Jimmy, thank you. Jimmy, tell me a little bit more about, you mentioned, going to classrooms, making this widely available. Now, this is using as your template the Khan Academy, YouTube kind of sensation. Talk a little bit about what it's Klight.
Right.
What exactly you're trying to, how exactly you differ from the original. What you do.
So the way Klight works is it's a software platform that can be installed on low-cost hardware. So anything from a Raspberry Pi, it's this little $35 computer, through to old existing infrastructure, old computer labs, so that it can take advantage of any infrastructure that exists rather than relying on a central sort of data warehouse where there's a website running. So what we've been seeing in the last while is sort of this move from the internet being what it was originally envisioned as, which is the very distributed ecosystem, towards more centralization. So the cloud is actually, although it seems like it's everywhere, the cloud is actually means data centers in very specific locations running high power hardware and serving a distributed area. But what we're trying to move back towards is a more distributed internet, where the hubs of content and processing are closer to the people actually using them. So that we can take advantage of, say, 3G connections where, for instance, across the east and west Cape of South Africa, there are many schools that have a single 3G connection shared for the entire school of a few hundred students. And so it's good that they now have some connectivity, they can get things in and out, but that's not enough to have video streaming into all of the students in that room. So being able to download the content slowly, sync it up over these slow connections or carry it in on USB sticks, and then when the students are accessing it, have all of that access be local to a local server, and also be tracking their progress, have a student account so they can see what they've been doing, what they're struggling with, and where they're headed. That really empowers them to take advantage of the same types of interfaces that people on the public internet can
use. So you described, your products are already being used in very divergent kind of situations. In Ghana, on the one hand, and in the Idaho Department of Corrections on the other. Talk a little bit about the different ways this is being used both domestically and internationally, maybe how that differs.
Sure, yeah. So in many cases, there are different reasons that people don't have internet. In the developing world, sometimes it's just expensive, people are remote, or the access just hasn't reached them yet. And so, for instance, in India, we have schools that are using little cheap Raspberry Pi Wi-Fi servers with these Akash tablets, cheap Android tablets, that are connecting through to it over Wi-Fi in the classroom. And so they're doing sort of a flipped classroom model. The students can engage with the videos and do exercises. The teachers can view the coach reports and see how the students are doing. In some cases, internet is restricted for legal reasons. So in many medium security prisons, inmates are not allowed access to internet. However, there are educational programs operating within prisons which could benefit, since they have limited teachers, limited resources. Also, the inmates are at very different levels. Some of them dropped out of school in grade 5 and are now trying to come back and regain some mastery and some confidence to turn their lives around. But many of them are in different levels. So having self-paced learning, having resources where they can work through the content themselves and see what the next steps are and move from there is a very empowering experience, because they can build confidence again and find a new path in life and realize that the stuff's not actually so hard. They can make a difference there.
So Peggy, let's talk a little bit about where the bottleneck is. As you know, Jamie has said about 2/3 of the world not being connected to the internet. What is the principal clog? What will it take to significantly change that number? Is it logistical? Is it financial? Is it governmental?
It's a little bit of all three, as you might imagine. In some cases, it's spectrum. It's just the airwaves that carry the information, and that tends to, in some areas of the world, be slow to come onto the market. And so, some ways, it can constrict it from that aspect. We were just talking earlier that you kind of need a total solution. So you can't just have connectivity access. That's very important. But you also need the content. The teachers need to be trained. There needs to be the leave behind, and particularly in many of the emerging markets, has to be simple enough, and maintenance has to be easy enough that after you depart, it can continue on. So there's a number of things. I would say, from a connectivity standpoint, as you know, the gap is closing. 3G networks are literally almost everywhere around the world, and then it becomes the devices themselves, getting to the right cost point, and those are just being driven down. There's a lot of competition in that space. The fact that you can have in a smartphone, in a low-end smartphone in India today, pretty much the same thing we had on our desktops just a few years back is pretty amazing. I mean, that statistic alone is very amazing. So it is closing. We'll get there. Right now in this in-between space, Klight is a great solution until we reach that.
Kind of, you said you had projects, what, in 30 countries, you said?
Yeah, over 30 countries.
What would a project be? Would it be just kind of distributing itself? What would you be doing?
We're doing several things. In Jordan, we're working with the Jordan Educational Institute, and we've gone into a couple of girls' schools there and equipped them one-to-one with 3G devices. And, sometimes in areas of the world, it is challenging to deliver education to young women. And so they've had, all of a sudden, access to the internet. And we've had some great results there. We're also doing a mentoring project with the Shri Blair Foundation. She has a program where she goes in and mentors young women entrepreneurs. And then after that, we stay connected with them, with young women here and women who've started their own businesses, to virtually mentor their, nascent businesses just via the 3G and in some cases 4G connectivity that's in place.
So, you mentioned competition before, and, I'm sure there are people in the audience who are kind of shaking their head. Of course, a company that makes the chips for mobile phones wants to expand access to the internet and to, communications technology. On the other hand, there are different models that people have for how you mass produce social change. One is kind of philanthropic intervention. Another is that somebody can make a profit off of it, that ultimately there's a business logic to kind of reaching the entire world or more people in the world that is more likely to get done than depending upon the goodwill of big institutions to do it. So I'm interested in your thought. When you said competition is driving down the price, is the way that you're going to get mass penetration of the access to the internet going to fundamentally be philanthropic, or will it be because businesses see a market there?
Absolutely, business is behind that. What we found is when we introduced these different programs, for instance, fishermen in India, we introduced a program where they could, at the end of the day, figure out which port to take their fish to get the best price. They had access to weather information that they had never had before. It completely changed their livelihood from previous to having the cell phone in their hand to then having it. All of a sudden, they were making 2, 3, 4 times more. And then there's that halo effect. That fisherman's making more, he's spending more money in the village is, all boats rise. And so, we have found that particularly in a lot of the emerging markets, when you have a small amount of disposable income, people are looking at things like, the basics, food, water, shelter, and then it's a cell phone because they've seen what it does to their neighbors' lives.
Interesting.
And that's something that I think sitting here in La Jolla, California, It's hard for us to imagine. We get a new cell phone, we say, wow, 41 megapixels on that new Nokia camera phone. And they're saying, this is going to change my life. I might have access to health care where previously, someone might have died. Now they have the access to health care. Get that child to a hospital. They'll have access to education and entrepreneurship, as I said.
Clark, we're talking here about kind of the way technology is going to empower individuals to kind of assert more control over their own lives, their educations, their livelihood. In your work, do you find, is there a subtle, what you mentioned before, we were talking about before, it is the central government often that's perpetrating. When people are out there independently monitoring, does it change their relationship, their acceptance of that kind of political structure?
It can cut both ways, but on balance, information is the enemy of the oppressor, usually. And if you can throw light on an electoral process or candidates or what parties are doing, it's usually it's a more robust democracy. So technology is not just working for our small project, but also it's used for get out the vote campaigns. Even in Africa, this is not just the US. They're pushing SMS files to their followers. They're texting in complaints about what happened at the polling station. There's a group called Ushahidi where they're a platform for complaints during electoral processes. So there's a lot of ways technology improves that process, And it doesn't mean that the government can't use it itself. They can shut it down. They usually have the main switch and shut it all down. They can send false texts as well. But on balance, people, and you've seen it yourselves on the TV when you have small clips of fraud conducted in Russia or small clips of some kind of tally manipulation in another country. These things would not have come to light before.
Talk about the broader issue. I mean, it was certainly around the dawn of the Arab Spring, there was an enormous sense of excitement that peer-to-peer communication, social media, texting, Twitter, it allowed people to organize in a way that you never could before in these closed societies, and would fundamentally kind of change the power relationships in them. 2-3 years later, the picture doesn't look nearly as sunny. What is your sense ultimately about how much enhanced communication and enhanced communication technology can change kind of the dynamics of power in societies?
Well, like I said, it works both ways. So information allows organization. And it allows organization for the good guys and the bad guys. So you have a demonstration, you can have a counter demonstration with the same technology setting it up. But what you don't have on both sides, on the one side, you have people who see things and can act on that information and give that information to others that is less in control of the government. And that's a new thing. There's a high newspaper readership in many poor countries and a high radio listening level in these countries. They're thirsty for information. So this is an avenue that they've never had before.
It is, the phrase I've used sometimes, you have mass communication now without the mass media.
That's right, exactly
which is
right.
something we had not had previously. So but in your experience, when you're working in all sorts of different places, are there clashes with governmental structures over the content that you're sharing?
So we haven't seen any sort of in general, the governments are fairly supportive. We have concerns ourselves about the content that we're sharing. We don't want it to be a sort of propagation of centralized sort of Western knowledge, which is why that's sort of a start for us. It's not the direction we're moving. What we're moving towards is, like we've been talking about now, empowering the local communities, giving them tools. So having tools for teachers to generate their own content within a classroom. So things that match their local curriculum, their local language, their local culture, and use that within their classroom and then share it back more broadly, which I think in some cases, governments may have more problems with because you're empowering the local populace to sort of self-organize and generate their own content and build new cultural systems around that, which may be more of a threat to the government than some external content being brought in.
Peggy, you alluded to this a few minutes ago, and this may be literally the definition of a first world problem as compared to what you were talking about. But there is by now a great deal of ambivalence in our society about the impact on families and kids and interpersonal relationships of just the enormous explosion of computing and communications technology. We have a terrific project at Atlantic and National Journal called the Heartland Monitor, which we've been doing the last 5 years. We kind of poll average Americans about how they kind of feel about the changing economy. And recently we asked, on balance, is the overall communications revolution that we're living through a good thing or a bad thing for kids? And we kind of gave them the arguments for and against. Slightly more said bad than good. I mean, they saw the good in terms of the ability to obtain information from all over the world and get in touch, but they also felt it was kind of isolating people and, people were kind of retreating into their devices rather than around the world. We're in the midst of this mass experiment. What is your sense about whether, are we more disconnected at the same time that we are more connected? Through the technology?
Yeah, education, obviously, there's pushback to introduce mobile devices into the classroom because of just that point. The kids are going to be looking at Facebook and other things. But I always say, can any of you get through your day without having a mobile device and just answering any question you have? You can quickly Google it and get an answer. And we shouldn't keep that from our kids. That is their new encyclopedia. But it does need to be filtered in some ways, and I think that is where I think there is a bit of struggle because there's so much information that's coming at you all the time in so many different formats. And one of the things we've been looking at is something we call the digital sixth sense. Your phone is smart and it's getting smarter. It has a lot more sensors on it. It knows where you're at. It knows if you're at home or work or school. And with various sensors on the phones, we believe there's a way to filter out some of that information. So for instance, as the child crosses into the classroom, there may be a set of information that they have access to, but you can block other things. And I think as we put more and more sensors into the phones, we can create an environment that's safe in the classroom, that's useful in the classroom, and we will say at the end of the day, it made those kids more productive.
Jamie, I was going to ask you, this is a little bit out of what you're doing directly, but just up the road in LA, we are going through one of the biggest experiments about using technology in the classroom, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to put an iPad in the hands of every K-12 student. What do you think? And I know several of the candidates who ran for mayor in New York have promised to do that as well there. What do you make of that? Is that ultimately going to expand kind of what students can be exposed to, or is it going to kind of atomize the classroom in the end?
I think one of the critical things there is, because we're all about equitable access, is that many of these kids are going to have that at home already. I think the big thing is that we get this big digital divide even in the developed world where many kids at home won't have access to those sorts of resources. And so I think proactively trying to get it to the students that wouldn't otherwise have access is a very important thing, just to balance that out a bit.
And Clark, that was what I wanted to ask you, kind of put on your domestic hat here, and kind of one of the questions about, if we go back to our original, what the title is here, Technology for Social Change, one of the questions is whether as we develop more powerful tools, they benefit the people who are most equipped to take advantage of them in the first place and actually serve not to expand opportunity but to widen inequality. I mean, you could argue that since the beginning of the computing age, by any measure, inequality in our society, economic inequality, is wider. So is the effect of everything we're talking about more to expand opportunity or to further concentrate it among the people who are best positioned to take advantage of what's emerging?
It's a nice broad question. I think it's context-driven. So if you have a monopoly of information in a country, say the countries that I work in, more information is better. In a country that has alternative information sources already, the ones who have may be able to exploit that more than the ones who have not, clearly. And it's also about incentive. So the incentive of those who have less may be more powerful in ways than the incentive of those who have more. Or those who have more aren't on the cutting edge. They're not pushed. They're not pushed in the same way to keep their position in the political world, as opposed to people who want to change the political world. They're going to be pushing the edges of technology and elections
but in the
democracy.
But in the economic sphere, what you're talking about is saying that basically as these new tools develop, you're more like, if you have someone who's an upper middle class kid both of whose parents went to college, they're much more likely to have to be swiping as soon as their fingers can move, and that in effect you see gaps widen. As the tools emerge, even though the technology itself, in theory, could be used to narrow the gaps.
And ironically, the more great content that we get and the more valuable the internet becomes, the more we're advantaging the people that already have it. And so that's why we're trying to counterbalance that. First of all, take advantage of that, but also counterbalance that by making it accessible, targeted to the people who otherwise wouldn't have access.
And how big an issue at this point, is the digital divide in the U.S.? There's almost ubiquitous access to the internet. There's not ubiquitous access to broadband. There's different ways people use things. What is your sense on kind of this broad question I'm asking, whether these technologies are expanding opportunity or kind of widening inequality?
Well, it's interesting, talking about what happened up in LA, those devices were Wi-Fi only, and what they found is a lot of kids don't have broadband at home, and so now they're going back and buying the MiFi connectivity so they can have 7/24 connectivity and have access to information and access to their peers and their teachers outside of the classroom, which they found that's a very important piece of it for kids who don't have that access to broadband. So getting access to broadband, I think, is the most essential thing that we can do, not only to our inner city kids, to rural areas. It's challenging to do that, particularly in a geography like the United States, to have broadband access everywhere. But that is the task at hand.
And President Obama, they are trying to update the E-rate through the FCC
Correct.
To produce a big pot of money to move the nation's schools into broadband. They did the first round of connectivity. What you were describing describes most American schools today. Just having one connection in the library, and they're now trying to raise the money to have a much more robust school connectivity where kids could be in a classroom with Wi-Fi on their devices.
So even in San Diego, we're working with High Tech High so because the students come from a wide variety of socioeconomic statuses, we're trying to find ways to get the kids who don't have access at home. So many of those kids don't have internet at home. And so hopefully eventually we can get internet to them at home. In the meantime, what we're doing is sending them home. They might have computers at home, sending them home with a USB stick that they can plug in, engage with content, do their exercises, bring it back in, plug it into the computer in the classroom, and it'll upload that usage data back up to the internet so that they can be working on par with the other students who are engaging with the Khan Academy materials.
You know, the other big area that, so the one anxiety about the kind of the digital world we live in is kind of kids and atomization or isolation. The other is privacy, obviously, and we've had an incredible year with the NSA revelations and the entire Snowden saga. And it's caused people to kind of ask about not only what government knows, but what the private sector knows, the price we're paying in effect for all of these free services that we get online. Peggy, where do you think we are about finding the balance between kind of service and privacy? Is this kind of a settled, or is this very much in flux in terms of what we're going to be comfortable with as a society?
You know, it's definitely in flux, and I think there is that trade-off. The more information I send out, maybe the data that comes back to me is more filtered and targeted for me, but then what do I give up from a sense of privacy? And going back to that digital sixth sense, we've been working on an application that, as it filters this data about you, it keeps it on your handset, and then I decide if I want to let that out or not. So, for instance, it might know that because I let it know that I'm a runner, and if I'm going through the mall, stores can be promoting out, and my phone can be filtering, saying, "Is there anything here for runners?" And I can bring in a targeted ad because I'll accept that. But I don't want all that other stuff, and I actually don't want the mall to even know that I'm there. So there's all sorts of different levels of privacy, but I would find a lot of value in that example. But I want to have control of my data, and I think that's what the Snowden case is sort of teaching all of us. Give us more of the control. If I want to let more out, I can, but if I want to keep it locked down, I can do that as well.
Clark, we should probably see more severe versions of this in some of the countries you work in about, as we have more penetration of smart devices, it does allow governments, as you said, it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Governments may find it easier to keep track of what people are doing.
They're starting.
What are the issues that are happening there?
Yeah, they're starting. Internet connections are often controlled by the government in these countries. They can turn them on or off, depending on their whim. They're behind on, at this point, they're behind on detecting things that are in social media. They don't have necessarily the expertise or the core to do it to a great extent. Now in China, that's completely different. In fact, one of my colleagues here at UCSD looks at China and the web, and they're constantly monitoring every chat room possible for signs of where there might be a group organizing for a protest, or signs of where an issue might be talking about the central party. Constantly, thousands of people.
Real quickly, is that people, or is that automated?
I don't know. But they have thousands. I know that we have thousands of workers constantly monitoring who just do this for the government. So governments can do this with enough advanced technology and an understanding of the web. Generally, right now in the poorer countries and fragile democracies, they'll usually just hit the switch. They'll hit the on or off switch. That's the crude way to stop the information flow.
Because you are leaving more tracks, vastly more tracks than any generation before.
Right, but the private sector is more powerful in the internet and information communication world in these countries than the governments. All of this has been driven with the private sector. The millionaires in Africa are all the first people who provided cell service. Those are the movers and shakers. The private side of the world is taken off. Governments are counting to catch up.
Interesting. All right, let's bring in the audience for some questions if we have a whole bunch. How about back that way to start?
Good morning, Douglas Mustapik. In regards to keeping mobile devices from kids, or whether or not that's a good idea, and the schools, how will technology change the landscape of education? And that being said, how would that adjust the curriculum? In essence, looking at, for instance, nowadays kids have really no idea how to do a tip at a table, because why? We have an app for that. And so just using that small example, is that allowing us to expand further because we don't have to focus as much on all the basics? Or is that just bringing us away from what we're really trying?
Good question.
Thank you.
So I definitely hear where you're coming from with these technologies sort of replacing or augmenting our skills in ways that we become dependent on them. I think at the same time, the materials that we can share through these to augment education itself. So in Khan Academy, there are exercises, I believe, or at least we were talking about this when I was working at Khan Academy last summer on making exercises for learning how to calculate tips. So I think it can go both ways there. I think having these tools augmenting our abilities, I don't see as necessarily a bad thing. If we become dependent on them too much, that can be problematic. But I think empowering ourselves, moving towards having more abilities based on integrating with these technologies, I'm sort of lean to being that being okay.
And just, I mean, we could have said the same thing about the calculator and long division, right? We lose the ability to do long division and multiplication because of the calculator. But I think the question, one part of the question I was really interested in, if in effect those baseline skills are handled by the technology, does it in fact give you the freedom through education to do to go further in other directions that maybe you couldn't have done before because you had to do those, you had to meet that minimum standard?
Yeah, very much so.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think we have over here. I'm just trying to get some new faces.
Hi, I'm Ken Rind. I'm a venture capitalist. Some years back, the UN asked me to give a talk on encouraging venture capital to enhance economic development. And I had people in the audience from various countries who said economic development is bad because it increases the gap between the rich and the poor. I find that bizarre. Do you think that's true? I asked the moderator first.
Do I think that's true?
Yeah, asking you.
Do I think economic development? Let's see. I actually don't know. I don't know the stat. I don't know the stats. I think in many countries, more economic development increases the gap between rich and poor as the society gets richer. But it would be okay. I mean, the history of I mean, certainly in the U.S. and U.S. politics, the history is that people are not that concerned about inequality if they believe there's upward mobility. When they become deeply unhappy about inequality is when they believe there is not upward mobility. And today, you have a better chance of going from the bottom fifth to the top fifth in a society in Europe than you do in the U.S. And I think that the concern about inequality is at its root fundamentally about upward mobility. So I would say, in your example, if you're going to bring economic development to a country in a way that allows somebody to start at the bottom and move to the top, I think that would be broadly accepted. It's when it seems to be kind of reinforcing privilege that it becomes more problematic. What?
Do you think economic development is bad?
No. But did you listen to anything I just said? I'm sorry. I'm asking a question. My answer was that economic development is seen as is a net positive for a society, but is seen as more positive when it contributes to upward mobility and not simply stratification and widening inequality. That's exactly the way I see it too. Yeah.
Hey, Bob Engler. I heard a lot about censorship and the government's hand on the switch. Is technology in the future where I don't exactly know who we are, can get around that and get information to people that can't be censored and the switch can't be turned off?
Well, that's
right. So that's something we're very excited about. I mean, this is getting back to what I was talking about, the internet becoming centralized versus the internet remaining or moving back in the direction of being distributed. So if we can have ad hoc networks, have sort of mesh networks or peer-to-peer networks where communities can exchange content directly and have direct connections to each other rather than going through some central hub. And if they can control their own infrastructure, if we can use this explosion in low-cost hardware to allow communities to develop their own infrastructure and directly connect to each other and share through their own networks, then it can be a very powerful. So with these mesh type networks, for instance, they could operate independently. If the line gets cut, they could try and any bridge back onto the broader network would allow everybody on that internal mesh network to bridge back out as well. So whether somebody brings in a satellite connection or has a 3G connection or pulls in a line or gets a long distance sort of antenna pointed at another country that has some connectivity with somebody else pointing an antenna, then it allows you to bridge back out. But the point is, having the majority of that infrastructure and the core of that infrastructure be controlled in a distributed fashion as possible.
Peggy,
yeah, I would just add that our cell phones are bristling with different kinds of radios. There's Bluetooth, Bluetooth LE, Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi Direct. So you can actually set these up very quickly now, these mesh type networks, and So not only for things like public safety, where maybe the cell tower goes down or there's been a power loss, the devices can still work with each other. It's not deployed yet, but that's coming because there are enough radios in there for devices to be able to talk. And then what you can do in your case is one device can be hooked back in at some point, physically hooked back in.
But having said that, I think one thing that really have surprised people about all the revelations we've seen over the last year was that there are so many centralized switching points where it was possible for a government entity to just basically vacuum everything up right there. You didn't have to be on everybody's cell phone. There were these kind of centralized nodes that you could go to get what you needed. Yeah, and so the system ultimately does have a lot of centralization, isn't it? And it does it not?
At this point, it
yeah,
does.
at this point
I'm
it does,
assuming,
yeah.
as a non-technology expert, that governments will have a harder and harder time pulling the switch. I just think that's going to happen. However, being a political scientist, which is like a professional cynic, I also know that the private sector driving the cell phone network in Africa has to negotiate with the government to build the tower. So the government still has a tremendous amount of control over the flow of information, over media, over the cell network. And I was told to me in Afghanistan that in the south, I was actually an election observer for one of the elections in Helmand province, where the Taliban were strong, that they had made a deal with the central government that they wouldn't tear down the cell towers as long as they turned the cell towers off at night for some reason, so they couldn't be detected or something. So, and the government said fine, because they didn't want their infrastructure torn down. So it's, I put the brake on technology as the answer to everything, because it does come down to politics in many of these situations.
Yeah. Let's see. Over there. Behind you. Yep. And then maybe over here and then over here.
My name is Sue Rutledge. I've just retired from the World Bank, and I wanted to ask you a question about development. We find that in many developing countries that the financial institutions are not entirely reliable. In Russia, for example, I know some very senior officials with the private sector who say they will not leave money overnight in the state bank because that information of the deposit will be relayed to the mafia overnight. And so they leave money only during the day and not overnight. My question to you is whether you see technology as being a way of bypassing that system of particularly for money transfer systems.
So that's happening now already. There's something called M-Pesa in Africa, where people are transferring money via their cell phones, just using simple text messages. And that's been amazing for the unbanked of the world. All of a sudden, they have a bank. It's safe. They can transfer in between. And it's happening, actually, it started there, but it's happening in many of the emerging markets, Philippines, elsewhere around the world.
Yeah. It's spreading quite a bit, right?
Yeah,
Very
mobile
quickly.
banking is big.
Yeah.
Mobile banking is really big. In fact, my understanding is that M-Pesa has a larger capital base than any other real bank on the continent.
Wow. I think we have one woman over here, did we? Yeah, so you're going to get the last question. We have the microphone. There it is.
Vivian Olmos, and my question is for Peggy. So wireless reach, I'm interested in knowing if the projects are generated internally or do groups approach Qualcomm? And is there an expectation that the wireless reach division does not generate a profit and is subsidized by wireless other projects?
So the program itself is strategic to Qualcomm. So I'm head of new markets, and we're looking at how wireless technologies can accelerate some of these new markets. As to your first question, I would say we get ideas from all over. And so if you go online, you see there's a way that you can submit ideas into the program, and they'll contact you about the feasibility and that sort of thing.
All right, I think that's it. I'm sorry, they're giving us the hook. Thank you all for joining me and thanking this terrific panel.